There are stories in history that most people refuse to believe when they hear them for the first time. Not because they are myths or legends, but because they are too strange, too unsettling, and too far from what we consider normal human behavior. One of those stories is this. There was a time when people in India, in sheer desperation, turned to eating bones. Yes, bones, the very remains of the dead, the fragments of life long gone. And the question that echoes through time is, why? Why would anyone do that? To answer that, we must step back into a world where hunger was more terrifying than death itself. Ancient and medieval India faced devastating famines, some so brutal that entire villages disappeared from the map. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, millions perished. In the famine of 1876 to 78, in the Madras Presidency, whole districts were left as ghost towns. Colonial reports, often written with a cold, detached pen, recorded scenes so grim they read like horror tales. Skeletons lying on the road, children with swollen bellies crying for food, and men and women wandering into fields and forests, trying to eat grass, tree bark, or mud, anything to silence the hunger that gnawed at their insides. It was in this abyss of starvation that bones entered the story. British officers, missionaries, and even some Indian chroniclers described the same unbelievable sight. Villagers grinding old animal bones into powder, boiling them into soup, and swallowing the bitter broth just to feel something in their stomachs. It was not about taste. It was not about culture. It was survival stripped down to its rawest, most brutal form. But famine was only one reason. There's another, stranger layer. In India's ancient medical system, Ayurveda, bones were not just lifeless remains. They were seen as carriers of minerals, strength, and even spiritual power. Texts mention Asti Churna, bone powder, used as a medicinal remedy for joint problems and calcium deficiency. While it was usually animal bones prepared in controlled ways, it shaped a belief that bones could heal, that bones contained something more than death. To a starving mind, these ideas might have turned desperation into justification. If the ancients said bones give strength, then maybe grinding them will keep me alive. The practice also seeped into ritual life. Among some tribal groups, the bones of hunted animals weren't discarded. They were ground, mixed with food, or even consumed directly, in the belief that the spirit of the animal, its courage, stamina, or ferocity, would transfer to the hunter. A tiger's bone, for example, was thought to give bravery. A boar's bone, strength. These weren't common practices in mainstream Indian life, but they existed in pockets of culture, hidden in forests, passed down through whispered traditions. Still, famine and ritual don't fully answer the question. Why bones? Why something that most societies across history avoided? The chilling answer may lie in what happens when the line between survival and morality blurs. Colonial reports hinted, in hushed tones, that some people did not stop at animal bones. In the most desperate corners of famine, graveyards were not just places of mourning. They became sites of scavenging. Bones of humans, dug out from shallow graves, were said to be ground into powder. Whether this was widespread fact or exaggerated rumor, it was believed enough at the time to haunt the pages of history. To imagine starving mothers digging at the soil, clawing at bones to save their children, is to stare into humanity's darkest shadow. But here's the twist. Not all bone-eating in India came from desperation. Some came from devotion. Among the Aghori ascetics, a sect known for dwelling in cremation grounds, bones and ashes were not just tolerated, they were sacred. They represented the impermanence of life, the closeness of death, and the breaking of all taboos. Some Aghoris were known to consume substances from the cremation ground, not as food, but as ritual offerings to transcend fear. For them, bones were symbols of liberation from the illusion of the world. So while the starving poor consumed bones to survive, the Aghoris consumed them to prove that survival itself was meaningless. Two worlds, separated by belief, joined by the same object, the remnants of the dead. The story of why Indians ate bones is not one story. It is famine and faith. It is medicine and madness. It is human desperation, spiritual extremism, and cultural complexity woven together. And yet, even after centuries, it leaves us with an uncomfortable mirror. What would you do if your children cried from hunger, if your body collapsed from weakness, and the only thing left to chew on was the remains of the dead? Would you eat the bones? Or would you choose to die? And that is just the beginning. Eyewitnesses wrote about how collectors would raid graveyards, pulling up skeletons from shallow pits, gathering human remains, and selling them in bulk. Famine-stricken regions, where deaths were countless, became suppliers of these bones. Imagine that, whole communities starving, while traders profited by digging up their dead and shipping their remains across oceans. It's a detail of history so grotesque, most textbooks never dare to mention it. And here's where survival and industry overlapped. In those desperate times, some of the very bones meant for export were ground locally and eaten. The poor, who could not afford food, saw sacks of bone meal meant for cattle or shipment. Many times, they boiled it into a thin soup. Not because it was nutritious, it barely was, but because it gave a false sense of fullness, a delay against the gnawing hunger that might kill them by nightfall. But this wasn't just about famine. In traditional Indian medicine, Ayurveda, bone had its place. The Texturaka Samhita, centuries old, classified the human body into layers: marrow, flesh, blood, fat, and bones among them. To heal broken bones or strengthen weak joints, ancient healers prescribed preparations made from animal bones, carefully treated and purified. Known as Asti Churna, bone powder, these remedies were believed to restore vitality. In some cases, cow bones were preferred because cows were seen as sacred reservoirs of energy. It wasn't daily food, it was medicinal, targeted, intentional. Yet when famine struck, the medicinal became edible, the remedy became diet, and what was once healing turned into survival rations. Still, Ayurveda wasn't the only influence. Folk traditions across India had their own bone practices. Some tribal communities believed that consuming powdered animal bones infused them with the animal spirit. Hunters sometimes mixed powdered deer or wild boar bones into their meals to gain stamina for the next hunt. In the forests of central India, tiger bones were revered. Crushed into paste or powder, they were believed to give courage and protect warriors from fear. While modern science dismisses these as superstition, the belief was strong enough to guide real diets in certain communities. Yet, we must return to famine, because famine is the darkest stage on which these practices played out. Colonial officers recorded one haunting sight again and again: families breaking into the bones of dead cattle, boiling them endlessly in giant pots, then drinking the thin broth that came out after hours of simmering. Mothers fed this to their children, knowing full well it had little nutrition. The boiling was less about extracting sustenance and more about extracting hope. A warm liquid, even bitter and strange, kept despair at bay for one more day. And when cattle bones weren't enough, whispers tell us, people turned to other bones. Human bones. Shallow graves left by epidemics, bodies abandoned by roadsides, cremation grounds with remains half-burned. These became silent, tragic pantries for the starving. Some British reports suggested cannibalism occurred during the famines, though evidence was scarce and often exaggerated. But bones, ground, boiled, chewed, were repeatedly mentioned, a detail too consistent to dismiss. At the same time, in a completely different world, India's spiritual ascetics, the Agoras, were engaging with bones from a place of belief, not desperation. Living among funeral pyres on the banks of the Ganges, these mystics sought enlightenment through breaking every social taboo. They wore necklaces made of human bones, sat with skulls as ritual vessels, and in rare, extreme cases, ingested bone ash or fragments. For them, the act wasn't about survival at all. It was about proving fearlessness, showing that nothing, not even the most forbidden substance, could chain them to human illusion. To outsiders, it looked monstrous. To them, it was liberation. So here you had two Indias. One of hunger, where poor farmers boiled cattle bones in mud huts to fight death, and another of mysticism, where ascetics consumed human bones in rituals of transcendence. Two extremes, united by one shocking image. People eating what most of us can't even imagine touching. Now, pause for a second. Imagine you're sitting with your family at night. Your children haven't eaten in days. There's no rice, no wheat, no milk. You're desperate. The only thing you find is a broken animal skeleton in the dirt. What do? Do you walk away and watch your family fade into starvation? Or do you break the bone, boil it, and give them the bitter broth that might keep them alive until tomorrow? That is the terrible human choice people once faced. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Hunger doesn't just empty the stomach, it empties morality. It bends culture, faith, and taboo until survival becomes the only commandment left. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because as bones passed from famine soup to ritual fire, from medicinal powders to colonial exports, they became more than just desperate food. They became a symbol of how societies bend in the face of death, and how history quietly hides its ugliest truths. But the deeper we look, the stranger it gets. Did you know bones were not only eaten, but traded like currency in certain times? Did you know they were once believed to connect the human world with the divine? And that even today, in small corners of India, traces of these traditions survive? The bizarre tale of bones is far from over. By now, bones are no longer just bones in our story. They've shifted from being desperate food to strange medicine to sacred objects. And in ancient and medieval India, they were something even stranger: currency, power, and bridges between the living and the dead. In the days before money reached every village, barter shaped the rhythm of daily survival. People swapped rice for salt, cloth for grain, fish for tools. And in some of the most curious records, bones themselves became part of this trade. Animal bones, especially cattle and buffalo, were exchanged in rural markets, carried in bundles across dusty roads. To us, it feels absurd. Who would trade food for bones? But in those times, bones were resources. They could be carved into handles, ground into powders for fields, or used in rituals. For some, they were the difference between starvation and sustenance. Even stranger was the hidden trade in human bones. Certain sects believed bones carried fragments of life force, even after death. Skulls and long bones were especially prized. Wanderers and holy men collected them, sometimes even trading them between temples or secret groups. Skulls became bowls for offerings. Femurs became ritual trumpets. Fragments of ribs or spines were ground into powders believed to contain spiritual energy. This was a world most ordinary villagers never saw, but it existed beneath the surface, quietly weaving bones into a web of commerce and belief. Families, on the other hand, treated bones with reverence. After cremations, bone fragments weren't discarded like ash. They were carefully gathered, placed in urns, and carried to rivers like the Ganges. To immerse them was to help the soul move on. But not every group stopped there. Some fringe sects took bones into their very lives. The Agoras, perhaps the most infamous of all, lived on cremation grounds, drank from skull cups, wore bone jewelry, and sometimes even ingested bone ash. To them, this was not madness. It was a philosophy. By confronting what society feared and loathed, they sought to destroy illusions and reach enlightenment. Where others saw horror, they saw liberation. Colonial times added yet another twist. By the 19th century, India had become one of the largest exporters of bones in the world. Shipments of animal remains left the ports of Calcutta and Madras by the ton, destined for Europe. But behind this trade was something unsettling. Not all the bones were from cattle or buffalo. Many were human. Collectors scoured battlefields, graveyards, and cremation grounds, gathering whatever they could find. In times of famine, when entire villages starved, shallow graves became sources for bone traders. In Europe, these bones were ground into fertilizer, turned into fine china, or sold to medical schools for dissection. Imagine the irony. While starving Indians gnawed marrow from bones to stay alive, those same bones were being packaged and shipped halfway around the world to feed foreign soil or to be placed on the desks of students learning anatomy. There are chilling accounts of villagers chewing on bones that were meant for export, desperate for whatever strength they could pull from them. What had been sacred became commodity. What had once carried memory became industry. Beyond trade and survival, bones were entangled with fear. Many villagers believed bones retained the power of the soul. If someone held onto your bones, they could control you, curse you, or bind your spirit forever. Cremations, in some places, were carefully overseen to ensure that every fragment turned to ash, leaving nothing for enemies to use. But in the same countryside, others treated bones as protection. Small animal bones were threaded into necklaces for children, believed to keep away evil spirits. Farmers buried bones in fields to guard crops. Sailors tucked bone charms into their clothing for luck. The same object that terrified some became comfort for others. Step back and ask, why bones? Why not wood or shells or something else? The answer may be hidden in human psychology. Bones are what remain when everything else disappears. Flesh rots, blood vanishes, organs disintegrate, but bones endure. To the people of the past, this endurance must have felt like power. Bones became the physical proof of life after death, the sign that something of us lingers. To eat them, to grind them, to trade them was to borrow that power. They were symbols of survival, of memory, of continuity. Even today, echoes of these traditions remain. Ayurveda still mentions bone ash in ancient recipes. Certain tribal communities grind bones into powders for rituals. India continues to export bone-based products, though now mostly from animals for industrial purposes. The Agoras remain on the banks of the Ganges, shocking visitors, but continuing practices that have lived for centuries. So when we talk about ancient Indians eating bones, it is not just a bizarre curiosity. It is a window into survival during famine, into rituals that sought power, into trades that carried death across oceans, into fears and protections that lived in every village. Bones became mirrors of what people feared and desired most. They were food in desperation, medicine in weakness, weapons in ritual, and currency in trade. They reveal how humans, when pressed against the wall of mortality, will do things that shock us centuries later. The story of bones is not only about India. It is about us, about what we cling to when we are desperate, what we worship when we are afraid, what we believe when nothing else is left. And in those bones, there's always more than just matter. There is survival. There is memory. There is the enduring reminder that what outlives us sometimes shapes us most. The further we peer into history, the more bones tell us about ourselves, not just the people who lived centuries ago. And perhaps the most shocking truth is how easily bones blurred the lines between the sacred, the survival-driven, and the grotesque. Consider the Great Famine of Bengal in 1770. Entire villages emptied out, the air heavy with silence where once there had been children laughing, merchants bargaining, women singing at wells. Starvation was so widespread that desperate people turned to anything left behind: roots, grass, bark. And when even those disappeared, records tell of people picking up bones. They weren't the soft, marrow-filled remains of fresh kills, but dried, brittle fragments bleached under the sun. They boiled them in weak broths, hoping some strength lingered, some faint trace of sustenance. It's easy for us to shake our heads, to recoil. But if hunger gnawed at you long enough, if your children's ribs showed through their skin, would you not do the same? Yet famine was only one face of this strange bond with bones. Another belonged to the ascetics and holy men. For them, bones were not reminders of desperation, but symbols of victory over fear. Walk into a cremation ground in Varanasi at night, and you might still see them. Agorists draped in bone necklaces, skulls balanced beside fires, ashes smeared across their bodies. To outsiders, it looks like madness. To them, it is liberation. By consuming what others find unthinkable, ashes, bone dust, even flesh, they try to destroy the boundaries that chain ordinary people. Fear of death, attachment to purity, illusions of permanence. One traveler in the 19th century described stumbling upon such a figure. A man seated in the dim glow of burning pyres, a skull in his lap filled with liquid, bone ornaments clattering against his chest. He looked at me, the traveler wrote, not as a man looks at another man, but as one looks at the distance between life and death. In that instant, bones were no longer waste. They were tools of transformation. But the bone story was also shaped by global forces. In the 1800s, India had become one of the biggest suppliers of bones to the West. Traders knew the value Europeans placed on them. For fertilizer, for refining sugar, even for fine porcelain. Shiploads left ports like Calcutta, carrying tens of thousands of tons of bones each year. But not all bones were cleanly gathered. Reports whispered of bones dug from shallow graves or scavenged from battlefields where soldiers had fallen. In some famine years, collectors scoured the land for whatever could be sold, human or animal. Imagine the eerie sight. Piles of bones stacked high on docks, waiting to be shipped across oceans, stripped of their stories, turned into faceless commodities. And yet, even as bones were shipped away, they never stopped haunting villages at home. Many Indians feared them. It was said that if someone held your bones after death, they could trap your soul, preventing it from moving on. Mothers told their children not to wander near cremation grounds, for the restless spirits that lingered there clung to the fragments of their bodies. Some communities guarded funeral pyres fiercely, ensuring no fragment was stolen, no ash pocketed by someone with darker intentions. Bones were never neutral. They were always loaded with meaning. Strangely enough, bones also found their way into healing. In certain Ayurvedic traditions, powders made from bones, sometimes burnt, sometimes boiled, were mixed into remedies. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, bone was seen as a carrier of strength. Just as marrow nourished the living, ground bones might nourish the weak or restore vitality. In famine, this line blurred even further as survival and medicine intertwined. What had once been treatment became food. The psychological side of all this is perhaps the most unsettling. Why bones? Why not something else? Maybe it's because bones are what remain when life is gone. They're the final testimony that someone or something was here. To consume them, to carry them, to trade them, was to claim a piece of that endurance. It wasn't about liking the taste or even believing it was delicious. It was about believing that something powerful lingered, something that could be absorbed. Think of it this way. When we hold on to keepsakes from loved ones, a ring, a photograph, a lock of hair, we're doing something similar. We're holding onto a piece of them, hoping that by keeping it, we keep part of them alive. For ancient Indians, bones became that keepsake, but taken to its most extreme form. Consumed, worn, worshipped, traded. And so, when we say, why did ancient Indians eat bones? The answer is not one story, but many. In famine, they did it to survive. In medicine, they did it to heal. In ritual, they did it to confront fear. In trade, they did it because bones had value, as strange as that sounds. Bones were never just bones. They were food, they were currency, they were bridges to gods and shields against demons. When you step back, what's most chilling is how thin the line is between us and them. Desperation, Fear, hunger, belief, they push people to do things we would call insane. But history shows us again and again. The things we find bizarre today were once very real solutions to very real problems. And maybe that's the unsettling lesson here. What would we do if stripped of our comforts, left with nothing but hunger and fear? Would we too pick up bones, hoping for strength in their brittle fragments? Would we laugh at rituals, or join them, desperate to feel safe? Would we dismiss bones as waste, or cling to them, believing they held the last whispers of life? History doesn't give us simple answers. It only leaves us with echoes. And in those echoes, we see ourselves reflected in the strange, shocking, and sometimes grotesque choices of those who came before us. Bones may seem lifeless, but the stories they carry are alive, pulsing with desperation, belief, and the raw will to endure. So the next time you walk past a museum case holding ancient remains, or even glance at a bone in your dinner plate, remember, bones are not just what's left. They are what kept people alive. They are what people worshipped. They are what people feared. And in the ancient past of India, they were sometimes the most bizarre answer to the most human question: how far will we go to survive?